Anthony Fauci has been confronted as being a fraud and a liar. He was wrong about effectively everything when it comes to the nature of COVID-19, its origins, things like natural immunity, viral spread, transmissibility, the effectiveness of the vaccine, the long development time of the vaccine, the process of how long we should wait, and then how fast his position switched, as many of his positions consistently switched and flip-flopped throughout the entire COVID pandemic. Based on what the establishment needed, he would consistently shift the goalpost. Let's go ahead and jump in. You know it's bad when CNN is calling out Anthony Fauci. That's when you know the narrative is truly dying. Let's jump into this article. From the New York Post, Fauci roasted as fraud and liar after being confronted with damning study on masks. Man, this is so fascinating to see CNN put their tail between their legs, and effectively roll over and say, you know what, you've got us, and turn on people who were the head of the COVID establishment, people who flip-flopped on all of their positions, and were wrong about effectively everything. I genuinely wish I was making content during the COVID crisis, because man, my track record was so much better than all of these absolute clowns that completely destroyed the economy. Moving on. Social media erupted after Dr. Anthony Fauci was confronted by a CNN host with a study showing face masks made little to no difference in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Conservative critics pounced on the former White House chief medical advisor after he acknowledged the masking study during the Saturday segment. While this continuing segment insisted that at an individual level, other research shows that face coverings are effective at curtailing the spread of the virus. When you're talking about the effect of the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole, the data are less strong, Fauci admitted to CNN's Michael Shermish. So what's so wild about this? He's like, when you're talking about the effect on the pandemic as a whole, but on the individual level, well, here's the deal. Grains of sand make a heap, and at the individual level, expanding outward would then effectively make the whole structural foundation for the pandemic as a whole, as Dr. Fauci says. So he's basically just wrong, and he doesn't want to admit it. Once again, he flip-flops and moves the goalpost so he can always be right, playing both sides so he can always come out on top. He says, but there are studies, Michael, that show that in individual levels for individuals, they might be protective, he says. That's it. But might be other studies. Okay, if that's the case, Anthony Fauci, if there are other studies, I want you to name them. What are those studies? Since you're the person who is deemed the science, and you said when people are attacking the narrative and talking about COVID and attacking you personally that they're attacking science, well, why is it that the science can't relay me some data and explain to me what studies, when they were produced, who wrote them, and why? What was the control variables, and what was the purpose behind the reasoning that this was started? Did they find anything unintentional in the process of doing this research? Did they find their stated end goal? Did they do so in the allotted time frame? Did they find it consistently when they ran through the trials that they were running to find the data for these trials? We don't get any of that. Nothing. He just gives these these infuriating platitudes. I'm really trying to bite my tongue here because I'm going to absolutely lose my mind, and I can't do that because my sister's sleeping in the room across the hall. So, what we're going to do is move on. It says, Fauci admits that masks don't work for the public at large, but still absurdly claims masks work on an individual basis. More subterfuge, Senator Rand Paul says, a political nemesis of Dr. Fauci. And if you want to see some great clips, just go look up Rand Paul versus Dr. Fauci in the Senate hearings, just absolutely grilling Fauci, treating this little gremlin, demon, exactly how he deserves to be. Like a devil, like someone who deserves to be locked in a cell for the rest of his life because he completely destroyed the financial economic order that established so many people across the Western world and across the Eastern world. What this did was completely skew the capacity for people to move upward in the economy for, at minimum, the next 20 to 30 years. There was a shift of $3.5 trillion from the lower and middle class to the upper class. This is the first time in history that money has ever transferred from the lower and middle class to the upper class rather than operating on the trickle-down structure as many people have talked about. I'm just going to leave it there. What we see is it says, this is amazing, according to Fauci. Masks work on the individual level. And he just keeps repeating that exact same thing. Well, what we see is they really work on the individual level. I'm just going to lose my mind talking about this. Someone at CNN said, holy shit, a CNN director just confronted Dr. Fauci on air with the bulletproof science point. Wow, someone at CNN actually confronted and talked about this. And they're like, wow, someone at CNN at our own network was talking about this. Man, this is unbelievable. And I have here some videos, and it's the segment with Dr. Fauci himself talking about this. This is from Kanoka the Great, or Kenkoa the Great. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this. But the tweet says, CNN asked Fauci why the highest quality scientific evidence consistently shows that masks do not work. The quote is, the most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of the respiratory illness, including COVID-19, was published late last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist, who is its lead author, were unambiguous. There is no evidence that masks make any difference. Full stop. Fauci responds, yeah, but there are actually other studies. And like I said, okay, if that's the case, Mr. Science, go ahead and show me the studies. Just tell me about them. I can go read them. I can look them up myself. I'll go find the data. I'm really good at prowling through data. But no, you don't do that. You don't give any of that because you know you have zero credibility to what you said because you've jumped from goalpost to goalpost in an attempt to play both sides because, like I said, he wants to come out on top. Let's go ahead and get into this clip.
I would hope that if, in fact, we get to the point where the volume of cases is such and organizations like the CDC recommend, CDC doesn't mandate anything, recommends that people wear masks, I would hope that they abide by the recommendation and take into account the risk to themselves and to their families. And again,
okay, let's go ahead and start this over again because I love the look on this guy's face because he's clearly got this study in mind, and I'd argue he probably knows what card Fauci's going to play, considering he's played the same card on CNN for the past 3 years at a minimum. Let's go ahead and restart this. We got 20 seconds. Look at his eyes. This is the face of someone who realizes that you are talking to a shisty shit peddler. Nothing more than a filthy, filthy smear merchant that's trying to lie to you. People in the pharmaceutical establishment should be looked at much like how the tobacco executives of old were looked at, just like how journalists of the modern age should be looked at. Like they're trying to sell you poison and they will lie to you to achieve their end goal, which is profit.
I would hope that if, in fact, we get to the point where the volume of cases is such and organizations like the CDC recommend, CDC doesn't mandate anything, recommends that people wear masks, I would hope.
Really, the CDC doesn't mandate anything because what they recommended effectively was mandated through the government because the CDC was effectively operating as another arm of the government, which was dictating what governors did because it was giving their top-down orders, and these are the same people that assert themselves to the world empire. So they're going to do exactly as one of the extended arms of the world empire says.
Hope that they abide by the recommendation and take into account the risk to themselves and to their families. And again, we're not talking about forcing anybody to do anything.
He knows he's like going to
totally
jump
understood.
on him.
There is a perception out there by many, how many I don't know, that they don't work and that the data concludes that they didn't work in the first go round. Respond to that on masks.
Yeah, well, that's not so. When you're talking about at the population level, that the data are less strong than knowing that if you look on a situation as an individual protecting themselves or protecting them from spreading it, there's no doubt that masks work. Different studies give different percentages of advantage of where.
There's no doubt that masks work. There's no doubt. Zero question. Not a doubt in his mind. Don't worry, we'll get to Dr. Fauci countering that perspective in just a moment.
Bring it, but there's no doubt that the weight of the studies, and there have been many studies, indicate the benefit of wearing masks.
I'm going to refer to one of them. You've heard about it before. I heard about it from a number of radio callers. Brett Stevens in the Times talked about Cochrane. Put that on the screen. The most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of respiratory illness, including COVID-19, was published last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist who is the lead author, were unambiguous. There is just no evidence that masks, make any difference. He told the journalist Mayan Demasi, full stop.
There's no evidence that they help, full stop. And this is exactly what happened with lockdowns. If you go ahead and set up the established parameters of comorbidities and you see the established age of the people who were dying out from COVID and you age check the certain states, what you'll see is it didn't matter the states that had lockdowns or didn't, they had roughly the same exact death rate. It's almost like all of these precautions were arbitrary and it only made things worse by exacerbating the nature of what was going on with the economy by giving us a recession. giving us an inflationary recession at that. Moving on.
But wait, hold on. What about the N95 masks as opposed to the lower quality surgical or cloth masks? Makes no difference. None of it, he said. Well, what about the studies that initially persuaded policymakers to impose mask mandates? They were convinced by non-randomized studies, flawed observational studies.
Flawed observational studies with poor control trials and no randomized control trials at that. So, here's the deal. This is the big one for me. It persuaded policymakers based off the fact that it was normalized studies that were flawed observational studies at best. Do you see the problem here? The fact is that the people who are running the medical health establishment just get told what to do, and they pass along the answers to everyone else, and they operate as yes men and disseminate this down throughout the structure of government, and because of that, this is how tyranny subtly encroaches upon all people, especially under the guise of fighting something that is a new war. What did we have? We had the war on drugs, we had the war on terror, now we've got the war on COVID, and soon to be the war on climate. Let's continue.
How do we get beyond that finding of that particular review?
You know, actually, let's go back and click on this. Because it says, but wait, hold on. What about N95 masks as opposed to lower quality surgical or cloth masks? These are the masks that we were told actually worked and were effective. Also, if you go back and look at one of my last 2 COVID videos, you will find that I cover a study and an article that talks about the fact that N95 masks are actually dangerous and more hazardous to people, as well as the fact that people don't properly fit them onto their faces. And the way that they're hazardous is because of the chemicals that people can inhale from them because they wear them for such prolonged times that the masks effectively start to break down over time. Let's get back to it.
Beyond that finding of that particular review.
Yeah, but there are other studies, Michael, that show at an individual level for individual. When you're talking about the effect on the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole, the data are less strong. But when you talk about as an individual basis of someone protecting themselves or protecting themselves from spreading it to others, there's no doubt that there are many studies that show that there is an advantage.
So what this comes down to is a quote that I love from Douglas Murray. And Fauci saying, well, there are studies that show certain things. It's like, yeah, we live in the age of information. You can cherry pick certain bits of information to create any study. This is why you should read things for yourself and deduce your own understanding of what is going on. And you can't rely on left nor right partisan bias because they will always try and skew you in whatever direction suits their narrative and their end goal, which will be for their party to grab power. And the problem is we have to make the possibility of destroying that power ever more possible, because through the acquisition of power, you will only lead to corruption, because man is not meant to rule over each other. And you see this perfectly. It's executed eloquently in the most wonderful and perfectly distributed story of all time, The Lord of the Rings. Okay, moving on. I'm not going to go on a Lord of the Rings tangent, nor an economic rant about how this completely destroyed the economy.
Took at the broad population level, like the Cochrane study, the data are less firm with regard to the effect on the overall pandemic. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about an individual's effect on their own safety. That's a bit different than the broad population level. I would hope.
So, he doesn't explain why it's different, how it's different, the metrics that this is observed through. None of it. And as we said, Dr. Fauci is apparently the science. So why is it that the science isn't the person who can tell me everything I need to know about all of these different things? If you're supposed to be the science, because that's what criticizing you is. Criticizing the fundamental of the scientific method, even though you've sidestepped it throughout the entire process of the COVID pandemic. So moving down, we see at the individual level, LMFAO. Yeah, absolutely. And someone said, I know it's hysterical. And this is great. It says, I'm trying to follow the science, but it keeps leading me back to the money. 10 out of 10 would recommend. You know what? We're going to go ahead and repost that again. So let's go ahead and move on. We had this video, and this is from Tom Elliott. If you want a banger follow for Twitter and you want to see the corporate press as well as the establishment get broken down in real time by nothing more than their own words as they play both sides in an attempt to come out on top, well, look no further than the glory that is Tom Elliott's Twitter page. I'm going to go ahead and play this. This is 5 minutes long. I'm not going to go ahead and talk through it because I will endlessly break this down and this video will end up way longer than I intended to be. I will come back at the end. Let's go ahead and see what Dr. Fauci has to say, as he effectively argues for all of the points that he's made against himself. Let's go.
But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science.
If you're vaccinated, you really don't need to worry about getting it in a way that's serious or transmitting it.
That is true. That is correct, Chris. It'll either protect you completely against infection, and the chances are very likely that you'll not be able to transmit it to other people. The risk is extremely low of transmitting it to anybody else. Full stop. Vaccinated people are clearly capable of transmitting the infection. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better. If people are not wearing masks, then maybe we should be mandating it. I often myself wear 2 masks.
And I'm quoting you now, at the population level, masks work at the margins maybe 10%. To hear that they only work at the margins maybe 10% would make a lot of people ask, okay, then why was I wearing a mask?
You're really attacking not only Dr. Anthony Fauci, you're attacking science when you say that this is going to go away tomorrow like magic, when you know that there's no chance it's going to just disappear.
We hope this just goes away, burns itself out.
So my question is, why weren't you straight with the American people about this to begin with?
So the bottom line is, it's a guesstimate. I gave a range.
It seemed in that quote to suggest that you were basing your recommendation on polling and what people could accept. Is that not what you meant?
No, I mean, it's a bit of that.
We're seeing all of these school closures around the country. Is that the right move for children and families?
You know, and I think what's going on right now is generally an appropriate approach.
You want to start doing something to socially distance yourself. How dramatic that is, closing schools and doing other things, should be proportionate.
It went too far, that particularly for kids who couldn't go to school except remotely, that it's forever damaged them.
Well, I don't think it's forever irreparably damaged anyone.
The U.S. Surgeon General has called it an urgent public health crisis, a devastating decline in the mental health of kids across the country. According to the CDC, the rates of suicide, self-harm, anxiety, and depression are up among adolescents.
And the record will show, Neil, that we didn't recommend shutting everything down. First of all, I didn't recommend locking anything down. I recommended to the president that we shut the country down. And that was a very difficult decision because I knew it would have serious economic consequences, which it did. Yeah. Because if you look at the people that are politicizing me, there's somebody that all the way over on one level. But there are a lot of other people who look upon me the way they should, as a non-political person that I am.
They're not doing it because they say they don't want to do it. They're Republicans. They don't like to be told what to do. And we got to break that.
But now is the time to do what you're told.
Where did this virus come from, do you think, today? Did it come from a lab? Was it man-made?
When you have the animal-human interface and you have animals that come out of the wild that are sold at these open, what they call them, wet markets.
Place of origin was not within the market itself.
No, I don't think you could say that.
There's a report today that another intelligence arm of the U.S. government, this is inside our energy department, has joined the FBI in concluding that COVID began with a lab leak in China.
That the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute.
We now know that a bat coronavirus was enhanced in a lab. The National Institutes of Health acknowledged that it funded research of a virus that was studied at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The experiment unexpectedly, we're told, made a bat coronavirus more contagious than the original naturally occurring one.
Take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans.
Right.
You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly. And I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about.
They took animal viruses that only occur in animals and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
What we're talking about now is the gain of function research in studies that increase predominantly the transmissibility as well as pathogenesis and alteration of host range of the virus.
Nobody's lying here, Senator. It is you. I'd have to laugh at that. I should be prosecuted.
Yeah, Fauci, I'm going to say you should be prosecuted, along with every single person that assisted in instituting the COVID lockdowns, the mandates, and the crisis that was pushed top down by the government on everyone that absolutely destroyed the process of how we are supposed to naturally orient ourselves in the society that we've constructed to see best fit, which would be Western society as we see so far. I cannot get over the fact that this guy sits there and laughs and says, oh, I should be prosecuted. It's like, yes, absolutely. We should have Nuremberg 2.0 trials, and people like you, Deborah Birx, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, Mike Pence, and all of the other major institutional criminals, Rochelle Walensky, who else? Dr. Leanna Wen, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya would be a great person to testify against you people, because he could be someone who was going over the data that was ostracized from the public conversation because he was an expert that simply didn't agree with what the narrative had to say. The fact that things like the Great Barrington Declaration, the article that we just saw, the study that was read to Dr. Fauci, I'm forgetting the name of it, which I can't believe I'm blanking on it, if I'm going to be completely honest. The Israeli data that came out 6 months prior to us having any of the actual mask and vaccine data, because Israel got 90% of their population vaccinated so early on. And no, none of this mattered. None of this changed Dr. Fauci's whims. All he did was operate on the perspective of what the establishment needed him to say. And for that, he should be put on trial. Let's go ahead and see. He says, didn't recommend locking anything down. This is on 3/16.
I just wanted to read. There's an answer to this.
Oh, yeah.
So he says, I just want to read this. There's an answer to this, because I assume someone said, what should be the protocols that should be put in place to handle the nature of the COVID outbreak?
Go ahead, Tony. He was my mentor, so I'm going to have to let him speak.
He's your mentor. By that standard, I don't trust you by default.
The small print here, it's really small print. In states with evidence of community transmission, bars, restaurants, food courts, gyms, and other indoor and outdoor venues where groups of people congregate should be closed.
So, Mr. President, are you telling Mr. President?
And then Donald Trump comes back up to the podium, and what did he do? He pushed Project Warp Speed, and he pushed lockdowns, criticizing other countries that didn't lock down, and saying how great it was at the process that we defeated COVID here, when places like Sweden and Norway that didn't even lock down had the lower mortality rates than we did. Quite fascinating. That's really all I've got for this. This drives me absolutely insane. This gremlin should be driven to the point of... Not going to say that. Going to end that there. Okay, we're going to go on to this Dave Smith tweet, because if I rant any more about Dr. Fauci and what I think should happen, I will be kicked off of YouTube. So, Dave Smith said they lied about WMDs, they lied about Afghanistan, they lied about mass surveillance, they lied about COVID, they lied about COVID vaccines, they lied about inflation, they lied about Hunter, they lied about Ukraine, they lied about Russia, but you can trust them on the next thing. And are you going to trust them on the next wave of propaganda that gets pushed during the next election cycle and the next winter that is oncoming to us? Are you really going to trust the next wave of propaganda? That's all I've got for this. Thanks for watching so much. I'm going to have to let a cat in that's now meowing at my door. I really appreciate you staying and watching this long. Stay lovely, stay great. Peace out.